Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the Power of Purpose. My name is Lori Severson, and I'm president of the Edina Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber is a community partner in Life Reimagined Edina. You're going to be hearing a little bit more about that tonight, but I don't want to hold up the show here. I want you to get started on reimagining your life and finding out a little bit more about the purpose of passion. So I've got about 9 minutes after 6. Mark that down, because right now is the time when you're going to start to reimagine the next phase of your life. I'd like to turn the mic over to Edina Mayor Jim Hovland, and he's going to kick off the program for this evening.
Thanks, Lori. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Edina, where we have been working on finding some of that purpose and some of that meaning and trying to help folks in a different way. There's a couple of stories I wanted to relate to you. One is a story I heard from Richard, and it sticks in my mind because if you've ever been to Tanzania, or Tanzania, some of the folks over there call it, you could understand this so well. He takes a 17-day trip with people from time to time in Tanzania as they trek out from different locations and different camps, and there's a lot of nighttime activity. And when he was younger and working with folks and trying to help them find purpose, one of the things they talk about around the campfire at night, of course, is what is purpose, what is meaning. And he related to me that one of these old hunter-gatherers from the Hazda tribe, the last hunter-gatherer tribe in the world, sat there and listened, and he said that there's two important days in your life, and what do you think they are? They're the day you're born and the day you figure out why you're born. Not the day you die. The day you're born and the day you figure out why you were born. And so tonight we're going to have Richard work on that a little bit and talk to us a little bit about purpose and maybe help us all figure out why we were born. The other story just happened Friday morning. I had breakfast with a friend of mine who lives in Edina. He's a deacon in the Catholic Church. We were walking out, and he said, I'm getting calls every week now from these people. He said, I got a call this past week from a guy who's a billionaire. And the guy called me, he said, I need to talk to you. He said, I've got everything and I've got nothing. And I don't know what I'm here for. And so having said that, I'm going to introduce Richard, and we're going to talk all about why you're here. He's going to try to set us on a good path for finding purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, and good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for being here on this beautiful evening. The project that's going on here, Edina Reimagined, some of you know, and you have some of the handouts, though, is a portion or a part of a larger national project called Life Reimagined that AARP in Washington has created to really look at what makes communities relevant and what makes individual lives relevant and healthy in the second half. And so the state chapter of AARP, you might have met Jay Hoppola, who's over here from state chapter, the national office in Washington, and then Edina was picked as the first community in the country to do a Life Reimagined initiative. So we're just getting things rolling. And so it's really about vitality, longevity, and health in the second half of life. But let me start. Has anybody ever, I've been for the last 4 decades studying the whole thing called purpose. And purpose is, as we're learning now in the laboratories, in the science laboratories, is fundamental in many ways to life. It's not a luxury. And so, has anyone ever said to you, get a life? Your kids ever say that, or do you ever say it to anybody else, get a life? Well, the real question or the real comment might be, get a purpose in life. And here's why. Purpose is fundamental. 1 out of 3 people today, I used to write, and I have 2 new books coming out this year in the fall, and a PBS special coming out at the end of the year, towards the end of the year, on purpose. And so I've been doing field studies and writing, and as long as I can remember on this. And 1 out of 3 people today is struggling with meaning. They're in some sort of inflection point in their life. It could be just an age-related thing. It could be a health trigger of some sort, or a relationship, or financial, or a retirement. But they're at an inflection point where they're asking, what's next? And so 1 out of 3 people is not having a midlife crisis. They're having what I call a meaning crisis. And it may be at midlife, and it may be later life, it may be earlier life, but we know a lot about this now. So I'm going to spend about 15 minutes here sharing a little bit of a framework. And then Megan Newquist is going to come up, and we're going to do a little bit of an interview process here. And then we'll open it up to see if you have questions and comments. But 1 out of 3 people, if you just look at the person at your left for a minute here and see if they look like they're having a meaning crisis. If they look pretty stable, then look at the person on your right. If they both look pretty good, then it's you're the 1 out of 3. So perhaps that's why you're here. But so what we know is that meaning is as fundamental as money and health. I always talk about, and now that Bob's here, I can talk about this because he worked at 3M for many years. I gave a talk at 3M, and I talked about the 3 M's of money, medicine, and meaning. Think about those 3. They're all fundamental. The person you mentioned had enough money and maybe enough health, but without a reason to get up in the morning, beyond yourself, beyond your own self-absorption, your own survival in some ways, you're not as happy, you're not as healthy, you don't live as long. So money is fundamental, however we construe what is enough for each of us. And the second M is medicine, but it doesn't mean really pills or pharmaceuticals, it means health. So what if you have enough money and you have enough health or medicine? Then the question is meaning. And so what we're finding now is that without meaning, purpose, by the way, the definition, let me get that out of the way right now. Purpose is your reason for getting up in the morning. You can look at it as some kind of big philosophical or end-of-life legacy thing, which it ultimately is. But it really is why we get up in the morning. And so the meaning, or the third M, is just as fundamental, and it's a choice. And before some of you write this off, let me just suggest to you, my teacher, you've all had teachers in your life, I call them fortuitous encounters with teachers that really changed your point of view or changed your trajectory or your thinking. My first, that I can recall, real game changer encounter was with a man named Viktor Frankl. Any of you heard of Viktor Frankl before? He wrote a book. I always give him credit because he did change my life, and to this day I still study him. I still read, but Frankl died about 13 years ago, but when I was getting out of graduate school in counseling psychology, I was trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. I was at one of those inflection points. And you'd think in counseling, you'd figure that out. But it's always about everybody else, not about you. So I saw a poster on the wall that Viktor Frankl was giving a seminar in San Diego, a 5-day seminar. And right out of graduate school with no money, I drove to San Diego and I spent 5 days, and it changed my life. Frankl, for those of you who don't know, wrote a seminal book called Man's Search for Meaning. Don't let the man's scare you. He wrote it a long time ago. But Frankl was a thinker like Adler, Jung, Freud, names that are maybe kind of a little more common. But Frankl was living in Vienna. They were all living in Europe, and training psychiatrists to be better doctors and this kind of thing. And the Nazis took Frankl and his family. And he was in a series of 3 concentration camps. His family was all killed. They were all killed. He was the only one who survived, and he was liberated from Auschwitz. He weighed 87 pounds. He went home to Vienna. he healed, and he sat down and wrote Man's Search for Meaning in 9 days. And here's what he wrote, basically, in a nutshell. He said the reason that people survived, and everybody's an experiment of one, everybody's different, but generically, the reason people survived was they had a reason to get up in the morning beyond themselves. When they didn't have that, and so he said the last of the human freedoms is choice. It's to choose what you want your life to be about, regardless of the circumstances you're in. So people who have a lot of money, or a lot of health, or both, who don't have meaning, maybe need to revisit their choice about why they get up in the morning and why they do what they do. My favorite quote on purpose is from the American essayist E.B. White. He said this. He said, "I arise in the morning, torn between a desire to save the world and a desire to savor the world. This makes it hard to plan the day." Well, in all due respect to E.B. White, it makes it easier to plan the day. If you get up in the morning with a sense of, he said, "I arise in the morning with a desire to save the world and a desire to savor." I think a life of saving and savoring, a balance between, saving doesn't literally mean, as you know, save the world. It means making a choice to offer your gifts, your talents, what you have to others in certain ways. We live in community. We're tribal animals. We live in community with others, and if we're isolated, we know isolation is fatal. Isolation kills people. And it's not just in nursing homes. You could be in this community, have a nice house, be right down the block here, and feel isolated. So it's not about that. What we're trying to do with Edina Reimagined is to get people out doing things, learning, growing. And so let me just before I share a few more thoughts about this, let me give you a default purpose. Before you say, "Oh, this is too big, I'll think about it later, it's too tough, it's too philosophical." It's not. Frankl said, as I mentioned to you, that the last of the human freedoms is choice. And by the way, that book, Man's Search for Meaning, in case you don't think it's very influential, if you've never seen it before, it's numbered in the library, the U.S. Library of Congress. There are 25 books that are claimed by the Library of Congress to be the most most influential in American history. Man's Search for Meaning, written by a European, is number 12, Man's Search for Meaning. So it's had a huge impact on lots of lives here and lots of lives outside of here. But here's a default purpose. Grow and give. That's it. That's the message right there. Are you growing and are you giving? That's the power of purpose. For people who, it can be way more specialized, way more congruent or aligned with who you are personally, but to grow and to give. So how do we know this? Well, I've been interviewing people over the age of 65 for the last almost 4 decades. Karen, I don't know when we met, but it was a long time ago, and I was interviewing them way back then, decades ago. But and I've been asking them, every time I start writing or doing something new, I do field work. I go out and kind of the snowball, interview people about their lives. Particularly, I've been fascinated all this time with people in the second half of life. How many of you are in the second half of life? I'm interested in you. When is that? Well, it depends. If you look at it biologically, it depends on how long you're going to live. But if you look at it fundamentally, at a certain point in our life, we hit an inflection point. We hit a point where we start to look at where we've been and where we're going. And it can come at any age, but midlife, around in the 40s and early 50s is when it normally happens. But I've been interviewing people over the age of 65. And the question I want to share with you this evening is this. I asked them if they could live their life over, what would they do differently? And now that I'm 70, I'm going to bump that number up to 75, I think, from 65. But they're more interesting as they get older. So here's the 3 things that have stood the test of time, that have influenced my work and this message, but they're also now coming out of the neuroscience labs across the world. We're now starting, and I'll share an example of that in just a minute. So here are the three themes that the elders have said if they could live their life over. Number one, they would be more reflective the second time around. Now that doesn't mean they would go off to a cave and meditate or they would do anything, but they would stop, step back, push the pause button, and look at the big picture. Isn't wisdom basically looking at the big picture no matter what age or stage we're at? And so pushing the pause button to look at the big picture, and I said, well, why didn't you do that during your life? And throughout the ages, people have said, busy. It isn't just now with mobile phones and all this technology that people are busy. We've always been busy. And what is informed or what has awakened people is often a crisis. You know, cancer or divorce or a job change or an economic change or a trigger of one sort or another. And so part of the Life Reimagined message is reflection. It doesn't mean anything special, but we're trying to help people to make it easy for people to step back and look at their story. Where have they been? Where are they going? What are the real possibilities, as AARP calls it, in the next phase of life? Rather than just feeling stuck, kind of looking at one's options. Second theme is risk-taking, courage. People said if they could live their life over, they would take more risks the second time around. And they weren't talking about backpacking in Africa, or, well, that's good, but the risks they were talking about were risks to be authentic, to be more authentically themselves. The times they were happiest when they had a voice in matters, whether it was their marriage or their partnerships, their friendships, their relationships, or at work. The number one regret has been classically, and the career development field backs this up, has been a regret in the work world. People wish they would have been more found. You spend many people, depends on your life and what choices you made, but 60% of our life is spent working. You look at your lifetime, you get about 15% to really do it, pure freedom, if you will. By the time you do maintenance and all the other stuff that you have to do to survive, work takes up the hugest block. Whether that's now caregiving work or volunteer work or paid work, or work can be construed in many different ways, but it is still. So they wish they would have made better choices in that arena. And the third and final, so there's reflection, there's courage, and the third is purpose. Every single person I've ever interviewed has said that they want somehow, some way to make a difference in life. They don't want to just show up and have a good time or make a living and just be, somehow they want to make a dent. Remember Steve Jobs, who's been quoted ad nauseum in the press, including now by me, but has said that Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, or the creator of Apple, and said, I never wanted to be the richest man in the graveyard. I just wanted to make a dent in the universe. And I found that every human being wants to do that. So how do we do that? Let me give you a formula, and then I'll invite Megan up here in a minute, but let me just share with you, because people say, okay, I understand purpose is fundamental, I understand it's important, elders have said it over the ages, that it's important. How do I do it? How do I go about it? Well, here in a nutshell is the formula. You can either remember this, or you can jot it down if you want. It's in the book Life Reimagined. It's in, I don't know if it's in the materials here or not, but it's G plus P plus V equals C. G, the letter G, stands for gifts. What are your natural, most enjoyed gifts? What are the things that you turn to? How many of you have brothers and sisters? If you don't, you might have nieces or nephews or but kids. Are your brothers and sisters, using that example, are their gifts, their natural talents just like yours? No, most of you are shaking your head. Or if you look at your kids, are they the same in terms of their gifts? Nope. When did you start to notice? real early, right? So we don't know still. It's still being fought in the theological halls of the world whether we're born with gifts or whether we acquire them. But we know that we get them early. I happen to believe it's both. I think we're born with gifts and we acquire and develop some. But if I had $1 for every parent who came up to me and said, "Do you do this exercise with younger people? Because I got a kid who's a great kid but clueless about what to do with the rest of their life." Or I've got a brother-in-law who's really struggling and doesn't have the life skills to figure out how to use his or her education, type of thing. So gifts, getting up in the morning to use your gifts is important. Second, passions. Passions. Passions are about your curiosity. One of the things we know about vital aging is that the curious ones tend to do the best. That doesn't mean you have to go back to school. It doesn't mean you have to be but the learners, are you curious? What are you curious about? I was on a program not too long ago with a guy named Richard Saul Warman. I don't know if you ever heard of him, but he's the founder of TED. You know TED? He's the founder of TED, and he's a real curmudgeon. And he's quite a bit older than I am, and so when he talks, he sits in an easy chair, and like a wise sage or something like that. So we're backstage. He's going to talk, and then I'm going to talk at this thing. And he says, "So what are you going to talk about?" And I said, "Purpose." And he said, "You know what I'm going to talk about? Curiosity." And he said, "Are you curious?" I said, "Well, yeah, I think I'm pretty curious. I'm very curious." And he said, he hands me a banana. And he said, "Do you like bananas? You go to Africa all the time, and have you ever seen a chimp eat a banana? Or if you like?" He said, take this, have it." So I started to peel it. How do you peel a banana? You ever have problems getting that banana under your fingernail because of that stem and everything? He said, You're not very curious, are you? You've been doing these bananas for all these years. Flip it and do it from the other end." I did it and went like that, and I went, "Oh." He said, curiosity is about finding the extraordinary in the ordinary. It's not about curiosity it can be about the moon and what's out there and about what's in there or all that, but curious people are curious about other people. One of the things that my wife and I chide each other about, and I make this claim, my wife Sally, I say there's nothing more brutal for me than being at a party or being on an airplane or someplace next to a former anything. You got it? You get what I'm talking about? Former executive. I'm talking about that guy you were talking about, not you. A former teacher, a former anything. I honor people's stories. But what are you curious about now? What gets you up in the morning that makes you want to get out and learn about it, engage with it, study it, touch it, whatever? So if you know what your gifts are and you start to use them in the service of something that you really are curious about, now you got reason to get up in the morning. The third V, the values, it stands for values. So gifts is the G, passions is the P, and values is the third part of the formula. People who are really alive understand their gifts, understand their passions, and understand their values. And values are about the culture, the people, the way you like to operate in the world. In the work world, people leave organizations more than they leave jobs. They leave cultures, values that don't fit them in certain ways. Neighborhoods, the values don't fit them. Communities, the values don't fit them. So gifts, passions, and values, the two life skills that Life Reimagined are really about are self-awareness, knowing your gifts, passions, and values, and adaptability, making choices with those. So gifts, passions, and values equals C, equals your calling. Your calling. And calling is that urge to give, that urge to be connected. So give yourself a pause right now and I'm going to ask Megan to come up here and we can chat a little bit. But while she's making the transition up here and we introduce her, just for 30 seconds, just turn to the person next to you and answer the question of, I know my gifts, passions, and values. You can also say, I don't have a clue what this guy's talking about, do you? And or you could say, no, I understand that gifts, passions, and values. I think I'm using my gifts on things I do care about in environments that, just a quick check-in, a mood check here in transition, and then we'll see what's on your mind. So 30 seconds, thanks.
You have some ideas? I'd like to welcome with Richard right now at the table, Megan Newquist. She is news anchor for KSTP TV. And I would like to thank Megan for joining us, actually. She is the news anchor, so for the morning news. So her alarm goes off very early in the morning. And it's about 6:35 and it's almost time for bed, isn't it, Megan?
It's time for bed, yeah.
I will also be walking around with the microphone, so if you have any questions for Richard, just hold your hand up and we'll make sure that those get answered. Richard, Megan, take it away.
Thank you. Richard and I actually go back like 6 years.
Yeah.
And I forgot until I saw Richard again. I thought, oh, I know Richard from a story I did with him years ago on blue zones down in southern Minnesota. And Richard said, actually, we met when you were doing public relations 6 years ago in Lexington, Kentucky, of all places. And I said, oh my gosh, you're right. So it's, I was excited to be asked to be part of this because I think what you do is incredible. And it's something that, after interviewing you with the Blue Zones and seeing you talk at some of the public relations stuff that I did, what you do is so big in my simple mind. I mean, I read news and I relate that to people every morning and I kind of break things down.
You do it very well, I might admit.
Well, thank you. But I simplify, or we attempt to, very complicated issues into small little things. And so as I sit here and hear you talk tonight and we talk about purpose, it sounds really, really, really big to me. And I think, how do you make this something that is applicable to your life? How do you make it tangible? Because I want to know what my purpose is. Do I think I found it yet? I don't know. Does your purpose change throughout life? Can it?
It does, and as we evolve, but that's why I gave a default purpose at the beginning.
Right,
to grow and give. If you just
Yep.
put grow and give on a Post-it and put it on your mirror for a week, and ask yourself every day, did I grow? How did I grow today? What did I give today? It'll start to reveal itself over time. There are three actual myths about purpose, because it has that larger than life
Right.
feel to it in a lot of ways. But the three myths are this. Number one is that you have to have a cause. You have to find something like save the world type of a thing, or save the planet, or you just have to be not self-absorbed. Every moment's a purpose moment. Every moment's a chance to ask yourself, is this about me or about you? In every conversation, you can walk out of here or you can look at tonight and ask, are you trying to prove something to the other person, or are you willing to engage and listen to the other person? That's a purpose moment. So it's about being aware. You don't have to have a cause to have a purpose. You have to be awake to the fact that you want to contribute in this way. The second myth about purpose, Megan, is that in some way it's revealed to you. If you just wait, the lightning will strike, God will whisper in your ear. For some people that may be the case, but for most of us, we have to get out there and do something on a day-to-day basis. Act and then reflect. Act and then reflect. Look for those purpose moments all day long. And then the third one, did you want to?
No, go ahead.
The third one is that purpose is a luxury. That's the one that drives me the craziest. Purpose is not a luxury. It is fundamental. It's fundamental to health. It's fundamental to healing. It's fundamental to happiness and productivity. My friend Bill Thomas, Dr. Bill Thomas, who's one of the most preeminent geriatricians in the country, and if you want to see a TED Talk that'll blow your socks off, Google or look at Bill Thomas TED Talk on aging. And Bill Thomas founded the Eden Alternative. His purpose is to eradicate all nursing homes on Earth.
Oh.
and replace it with something else. The greenhouse and the Eden alternative were his first two forays. Here's what he learned. Even with serious dementia patients, the Eden alternative, the first thing they do when they build an Eden alternative is they put daycare in the middle. Second thing they do, they put gardens. Third thing they do is they bring in pets, even birds, cats, dogs. And so then they measure, if people have a reason to get up in the morning, to feed a dog or a pet, to read to a child, or to water a plant, they live 7 years longer and they have a much higher quality of life. That's the power of purpose. Purpose moments, and it's always outside of yourself.
What got you to this point? When did you realize, were you lacking purpose? When did you have the moment that you found your purpose? When did it become clear to you that this was your calling, this was your purpose for being here?
I didn't have any of those revelations like that. It was iterative over time. But I've studied people like Frankl. Right. I had these fortuitous encounters. But I actually went to school, people around here, you know the Bush Foundation, Archibald Bush. It's not George Bush, it's Archibald Bush from the 3M, the Bush Foundation. I got a Bush midlife fellowship at the age of 29, and to study the second half of life, and to study why it was, and Bush was really interested, why so many people retired and died within 24 months. How many of you know somebody who retired and died? How many of you know somebody who died psychologically? In other words, they kind of went on cruise control, the lights are dimmed. And they were fine when they retired. I mean, they were, and then all of a sudden, they started to lose, whether it was curiosity or whatever. So I studied that under the aegis of the Bush Foundation Fellowship. And I studied at the Harvard Business School, the Harvard Study of Adult Development, which is the longest standing study of adults. And it studies people from young to old. In other words, to do this study, I got to interview you every 2 or 3 years for your whole life to get this research. What they found was the same thing that Frankl had said. The people who did the best, in spite of all their education and everything else, had a reason to get up in the morning, had a sense of purpose. And I thought, so I came back, I quit my day job, and hung out my shingle, and I've been writing and studying it ever since.
Changing lives ever since.
Changing lives, yeah.
When you go on these walks through Africa and you meet people of different cultures, are the purposes of people you meet in the States different than the purposes from other people, or do you find that they're kind of universal? I mean, I know you talk about your main ones, and everyone kind of falls back on, the purpose for life, the meaning, the money, the health, all of this, and when they're at the end of their lives, they're talking about what they wish they would have done. It's universal? Universal.
I find it everywhere. Sitting around the fire with hunter-gatherers or elders, and Jungle Jody Schuster here from Borton Travel is the Africa expert. She knows, she's put up with my stories for years and used to do the logistics for my trips. But I've learned so much in these tribal settings in Africa. And at the end of one of my trips, I'll just build on as an example. With these hunter-gatherers, I was carrying a brand new knife. It's called a buck knife, and it's in a sheath. And it's a beautiful knife, never used before. And I noticed that the guy who had been guiding me all this time while I was there, he had a knife. These hunter-gatherers, they own nothing other than a bow and arrow and a knife and a digging stick. That's it, period. So this guy's knife had been sharpened so many times that it looked like a quarter moon. You know how if you sharpen something and it just kind of goes down, down, down? And he lives and dies, and that's essential to his life. And so I gave him, as a thank you at the end of the trek, my buck knife. And he looked at it. His name is Maraba. He's a small, really buff, midlife guy. And he looked at it, and he turned around, and he gave it to a young guy behind him who had no knife. And I said,
wow.
That was for you for the last 17 days of saving my bacon, day in and day out, and guiding and everything. And he said, I already had a knife. And I said then, on the values thing I was talking about a few minutes ago, I said, well, why didn't you give the quarter moon to him and keep the good one? And he looked at me and he said, to have two of anything in our culture, I couldn't, do that. So I gave, but to keep the good one and to give the bad one, those are the two moral breaches. And the reason we've survived for 40,000 years as hunter-gatherers is because we share. We're a total sharing culture. And when we stop sharing, we start to really change. What really changed was agriculture. All of a sudden, when people started to grow stuff, you could define whose land was whose and who ate and who didn't eat, and they don't do that. So, lessons like that go deep with me, and not for everybody, but I learned what integrity and values really look like in those kinds of situations.
What has been the most enlightening part of this search for the power of purpose, this sharing of your knowledge with people? What's been like the most enlightening part of all of this for you? Because what a journey it's been.
It's a great question. The most enlightening part of this was the night my mother died in my arms. I was teaching a seminar. You all know where Alexandria is, way up north or way west. And I was teaching a seminar, and I got a call. This was before mobile phones, so this is how many years? 20 years ago, 18 years ago, I think. I got a call from my wife that said my mother is in the hospital. She had a stroke. She's 78 years old. She had a stroke. She wasn't going to live through the night. And you better get home. She's in St. Joseph's Hospital over in St. Paul. So I had a large group, but I had a partner there with me, and so he took over. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I raced home, and all of a sudden, the sun looked different, the music sounded different. I knew my mother had breast cancer, but I thought she was doing quite well, and then had this stroke. So I got to the hospital, and she was gasping for breath, let's put it that way, in intensive care at St. Joseph's. So the nurse ushered me in and closed the door, and I just kind of lost it after all of that. And I didn't know what to do, and so I picked her up and just held her, and I just looked at her eyes, which were closed, and her face, and I just said, "Thank you, Mom. I think it's time to go." And when I said thank you, she took 2 more breaths and died in my arms. And I think I learned, Megan, more about purpose in that moment, that second, and I know your mom is here, than all the research. And I've done a lot of research on a lot of field studies and a lot of writing, 10 books about this. But I learned that this purpose thing doesn't weigh anything. You can't always see it, but you know when you're around it. And for my mom, she was a stay-at-home mom. She had 2 kids, and I think all of us at the end of our lives want some sort of completion. We want something. It doesn't have to be a big applause. We don't have to have a plaque on the wall or a large obituary, but we want somehow to know that our life counted and that we're complete. And I think that's what I learned in that second. And I studied a long time ago with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who has studied death and dying, but this is real, tangible, visceral for me. And so I learned that as hard as it is to sometimes express this, it's in all of us. We want this. Steve Jobs, same thing. So that was probably the most enlightening moment for me.
The thank you, allowing her to know she made a difference and to move on and be appreciated. Wow. Well, I'd like to open this up to anybody that has a question for Richard. Lori is in the back with the microphone, so if you have a question, just kind of raise your hand. If you have a thought,
Or a challenge, could be whatever. We're a learning community here in Edina, so whatever's on your mind is just fine.
Do you feel like you can, I'll just keep talking, so if you guys have something, just kind of throw your hand up there.
Yeah.
Is people search for their purpose, is it something that you get together in a group and you kind of brainstorm? Is it something you do on your own? Is it something you discuss with your spouse? How do you find it? I mean, I know you're there, and I know there's not a clear answer, and I can't go home and it will hit me, like you said.
Yeah.
But I think people struggle to really find the purpose, because you want it to be meaningful. You don't want it to be something small. And you talk to other people and they have a purpose which just seems incredible, and you wonder how they found it.
It usually comes at inflection points, as I said, trigger points. However, what I recommend is very strongly, and I learned this from one of my clients, Mayo Clinic. I don't know if anybody's here from Mayo, but when Mayo sends somebody home from surgery or from an illness or something, and if there's nobody there, no support system, people don't do so well, don't heal as quickly. And what I said very early on was isolation is fatal.
Right.
So what I recommend to anybody today is that you have a sounding board. A sounding board. You could call it a kitchen cabinet. You could call it your fireside circle. When I take people to Africa, they could go on all kinds of Jody's trips, but the ones that go on my trips, it's called Back to the Rhythm. And people say, what's this Back to the Rhythm thing? And I said, I can't really explain it to you, but when you're there, tell me when you get it. And it takes about 3 days of sitting around the fire, slowing things down, taking a deep breath and not having a cell phone, not having, going to bed when you're tired and getting up when you're not tired. And this, for people to say, I now am starting to click in with what really is important to me. A sounding board has 3 people on it, minimally. So just to be practical. Number 1, so a sounding board, kitchen cabinet. People you get around, you could have a glass of wine with them, you could it could be a study group, it could be a book club, it could be your friends, but you're there for each other in support. And you're not, you're willing, so number 1 person on here is your committed listener. Who is your committed listener? If you don't have a committed listener, women do a lot better than men on this, by the way. When I ask who's your committed listener, most men, if they're married or have a partner, always pick their partner, and most women never pick their husband. And so, and so committed listener is somebody who is willing to hear your story without fixing you. That's where men get off badly. In other words, care versus cure. If I want to be fixed, I'll ask, but just hear me out. I don't know if this is what I want. I don't know, but let me rattle here. So committed listener. The second person on your sounding board is a catalyst. Somebody who inspires you. They'll only listen so long. They practice tough love. In other words, I've listened to you, Megan, now for 6 months. Why don't you just go and talk to him or her? Why don't you read the book? Or why don't you make them? So they're a catalyst to inspire you to act, either through the way they're living their lives or through the questions they're willing to engage you. And the third person on a sounding board is what I would call a teacher or a wise elder. Some people call that a mentor, but somebody who's a little farther down the path than you, and who you can talk to, who holds the larger lens on things. So I think people go on these Africa trips. I'm not here pitching those at all. But they go to get away from everything so they can take the time to have kind of a sounding board experience. Yeah. And then they come back and they say, now what am I going to do? I don't have one at home. I said, well, you have to create one. And I think it's really, particularly in the second half of life, isolation is fatal. And there's plenty of isolation in this community. It's not about just being in a nursing home or being in an elder situation. You can be in this room and feel isolated. And so engagement is what it's about.
You can feel even isolated in your house. I mean, I guess my sounding board group can't be my 2 3-year-olds.
Well, it actually
sometimes
is.
feel isolated
it's
around
not.
them.
I think pets, for a lot of people, pets are really important that way. And it's, you can laugh about it, but those pets know everything, right?
Megan, I think we have a question over here, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So I think it's really exciting that Edina is engaging in this larger conversation about amplifying purpose and maybe having a community around Edina to help people figure that out. One of the things, as I listen to you talk, individually I can understand finding my purpose, but how do you reconcile that when you sort of look around, and this is one really good step, hopeful step, but so much of what you see in corporate America or public policy and politicians absolutely are not in alignment with what you're saying. So how do you reconcile that?
With great difficulty. But I hearken back to something that Carl Jung said a long time ago. He said this, it's a kind of a parallel. He said, the greatest damage you can do to your kids is your own unlived life. So the starting point is to live out your gifts, passions, and values, or however you want to think about your story. And no matter what we say, that's the starting point. We have to live with that level of courage and integrity, which is not easy, and then make our moves in the larger. I hear you loud and clear. And I think what's interesting to me when you talk about corporate America is that I was chatting with a woman who's a number 2 woman in the Department of Labor who's very interested in this Life Reimagined thing. She said, do you know, Richard, that 41% of the American labor force is now freelance? 41%. Contingent workers, part-time workers, freelance workers, contractual workers, and it's going to grow to over 50%. The millennials don't want to work in these places anymore. And so I'm not against these organizations. I just think they got to wake up to some things if they want the best and the brightest to be working at these places. They'll work there. They'll put in their time if they have to, but there's so many more options now as the economy loosens up for these other choices.
Do you have another question? Thanks. We're very lucky to have you here, so I'm very appreciative. Did you ever, or have you studied Tom Kitwood from England, Dr. Kitwood, and his work? One of the books he wrote was Dementia Reconsidered, and he talks about in that book about connectivity and about purpose and about well-being and ill-being, and of course Bill Thomas has spent part of his career really trying to help people understand connectivity. As you look at Edina today and you look at the goals, and with ARP helping support this, what are your goals for us in terms of kind of in the first phase of this? Because this is the first evening I've been able to attend, and how do you think we're doing?
Wow, that's a big question, and I'll answer it quickly because we're nearing the end here. But I got a chance, Mayor Jim invited me to sit in yesterday as the Edina City Council was going through the vision. Is that what it's called? The vision strategies, kind of fine-tuning it. And I wasn't, it's a working session, and I wasn't invited to be part of the working session, but he just invited me to observe with a Life Reimagined lens. I was really encouraged that the vision, in many, many ways, totally synced up or aligned with what Life Reimagined and AARP has in mind. But I want to live, I live here, I work here, I have an office here in Edina, I live here part-time, I live out on the St. Croix River the other part of the time, and I want to live as I age, and we're all aging, we started when we were born, but in an intergenerational community. I don't want to live in a community with people just like me. I want to live in an intergenerational, diverse community, and I want to live in a learning community, the grow and give type of thing, where and infrastructure is important and all the stuff that was also in the plan. But what I think is really is what does a successful aging community look like from a cultural standpoint, from a volunteer standpoint, from an engagement standpoint? What can we do to amp that up? So it's a great question. I love having you ask it, but it's a long one to dig into. But I'm committed, I know Jim's committed, and hopefully we get the city council committed, because I know Scott Neal and others are committed to really making Edina a poster child without it being, being a positive poster child for experiments in this way. That's why they pick. In fact, the AARP National Board is meeting here in Edina in June. First time they've ever been here. And that's a sign right there that they're interested as well in what's going on here. And so we're going to have Jim and others speak with them at that time. So are we, do we have
We have
any
a
more
couple
time?
more
or
minutes.
a
We
few
have
more
one more
minutes?
question over here.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, this is a two-part question, which you've spoke to a little bit already, but I'll have you speak to it directly. So one is, what role do you think community plays in purpose? And then the second part question is, community, the sense of community is on a decline. Why do you think that is?
I don't know how to answer the second one because every community is different and but I think one of the things that I see happening relative to the second question is that as we've become more connected technologically, we've become more disconnected emotionally. This is a very troubling thing for me. I'm not a Luddite. I use technology. I like it. But I'm finding that I teach in several business schools, and I'm finding that these MBAs, you don't know how to listen, you don't know how to talk to people, and it's not just about being an MBA, it could be something else, but we've got to balance this out in certain ways. I think what's happening also is that people are wanting, what I said earlier, to live in a village. They want to be in a place. That's why Edina's got little villages, but so what was the first question again? What's the role of community? Yeah. I mean, community is essential. It's essential because we don't live in isolation, to live in ways that we connect. So whether you call it volunteerism or caregiving or engagement, I mean, when only 16% of the population votes in certain places, I mean, that's really, so I don't want to go off into the ether on this, but what I find is that people get older, they have a deep hunger for community and connectivity. And they want, in many ways, it used to be that it was, you know, we lived on farms or we lived in smaller communities. It used to be more about your family. Now what is really going on, what I think is very interesting, is a new definition of family. There's all kinds of combinations of, not, maybe they don't call themselves families, but coalitions. What's going on downtown right now, for example, with Mill City Commons and other things like this, where people look after they come together, they create an association to look after each other, to shop for people if they're sick, there's medical nearby. I think those kinds of things, older people, particularly older women right now, but older men and women, are going to drive that sense of community that is absolutely essential to a long life. You cannot live a long life in isolation. You can maybe be busy earlier than that, doing everything, but along the way, that hunger needs to get fed. So, Megan, any last questions on your part?
I don't think so.
Yeah. Anything else, Lori? That's Dick. Yes.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Dick.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank you for listening.
Good evening. I'm Dick Crockett, the Executive Director of the Edina Community Foundation. I was living a simple life until yesterday morning when our Chamber Director, Lori Severson, called me up and said, Dick, we have a simple job for you. We'd like you to follow Richard Leider on the program. So I'm going to try and do that by keeping it simple, basically covering two things, what we all have in common and what's next. These are big questions for Life Reimagined. I think what we all have in common is you either all have or are in or will have a significant life transition that calls for us to do this kind of work in reimagining our life. That's certainly true with the people you've seen so far. You've heard a lot about Richard's process, and I know another one that he didn't mention, which is that about 6 or 8 years ago, he had a vision of there being a Life Reimagined Institute in Edina, and convened some people to talk about that. It didn't appear like it was going to work out, so he reimagined it based in Washington with AARP, and that is working out pretty well. You heard from our mayor. There was a time when our mayor was happy practicing law in Minneapolis, living in Edina. He decided maybe he should reimagine himself as a public servant in Edina, so he decided to run for the city council. And not too long after that, the mayor approached him and announced he was leaving, and maybe he should reimagine himself as a mayor. So he ended up doing that, and then just within the last year, he thought about reimagining himself as actually working in Edina full-time, so he moved his office to Edina. I know that none of these are simple decisions, and they involve basically the kind of process here. We have a chamber director, Lori Severson, who about 4 years ago was living in Milwaukee. Not a bad life, but she imagined a better one in Edina, and we're glad to have her here. 15 years ago, I was in Syracuse, and my wife and I decided to reimagine ourselves working and living closer to our family and cultural roots. So here we are, and it's been a good move. We are, Lori, Jim, and I are three of the people on the leadership committee for the Life Reimagined Edina program. Cheryl Gunnis, who represents the public schools, community education services is another one. Jay Hopla, who is part of the leads Minnesota ARP office, is here. We have a founding partner in the form of Waddell and Reed, financial advisors. I'm not sure if anybody from Waddell and Reed is here. Good. Rebecca is here, for sure. And somebody else? Okay. And then we have another financial partner in Fairview Southdale Hospital. Anybody here from there? Here we go, thank you. And I think I've pretty well covered the territory there. This leadership committee of local resource groups has been recruited, going back to Richard's invitation to allow Edina to serve as a pilot project and work with the national and state ARP in answering that question, what's next? The particular focus of our pilot project for the nation is to see what we can develop by way of local resource and networks to accompany or supplement the ARP programs. So what's next will for you be a combination of programs that come from the National ARP or Life Reimagined Institute. Richard is one of several thought leaders that will be generating content and messaging for use to your benefit. Jay with the State ARP office is providing some of the programs that come out of that. For some of you, the next event might be a checkup, if you haven't done that. How many of you have done a checkup before tonight? If any of you are curious about that, talk to these people, because I think you'll find enthusiastic support for that program. We have started to answer the local part of what's next by hiring a director, Jan Schubert, who's standing back by the door. We have a website, and it's going to be changing. So right now, I think it is edinareimagined.com, and it'll soon be changing. What you might guess if you followed the evening closely is we know who all of you are, and we know how to reach you. That doesn't mean we're going to be on your email network for the rest of your lives, but you're at least going to get an initial message from us that tells you what steps you can take for the what's next. There is in your materials a little calendar of events that are now planned. We encourage you to take advantage of this. We actually have, as you go further on this, and to Richard's books, a real commitment to exposing people in our community, Edina and neighboring communities, to the 6 steps of reimagining life. What he's been talking about tonight is basically the reflection piece. What is your purpose? And then the next one is connecting, and all of us who've made these transitions have connected with somebody as part of that. Then exploring the options, then choosing where you want to go, what your values are, and what would be consistent with that. Then unpacking and repacking your bags. That's a whole separate book. There's a virtual library here of things that come from Richard that can help you in this process. And finally, acting. So you're seeing some people here tonight who've acted at one phase in their life to make this change. We're going to try and bring the resources of the community together to help all of you, to the extent you're interested, take advantage of that. And that's my simple follow-up to Richard Leider. Jan, Jim, Richard, Jay, Cheryl, do we need to add anything? Thank you. We really appreciate you helping kick us. Jan, back there. Yes. I suppose it's just a coincidence that the great study of community in the United States is called Go Bowling? The Putnam book, what is it? Bowling Alone. On May 5th, we're going to offer you an opportunity to bowl with other people, no longer bowling alone. Thanks for coming tonight. We look forward to seeing you in our future programs.